Hello, I'm Conrad Wolfram,
And I'm Jon McLoone.
and this week's Computational Conversation is a discussion on whether mathematical models, conceptually and in practice, have improved society or not. Now, Jon, I know you did a talk about modeling, and I thought to get us going on this, you should walk us through an explainer about what modeling is and maybe kick off a few of the thorny issues around its use.
Yeah, okay. So let me start with a really basic abstracted idea here of what is a model, because it's a pretty broad field, really. And I'm going to call it something where you have a representation of a thing that lets you make predictions about the original thing. So even back to ancient times, when people first drew maps, that's a representation of the world. And without having to travel south from France to discover that that's the right route to Spain, you could predict that if you went south from France, um, you would hit Spain because the map allowed you to do that quicker and easier and safer than running the real experiment. So fast forward a couple of thousand years from those kind of early representations, and we've built elaborate frameworks for all kinds of representations of mostly real world things, but also sometimes of more abstract things that allow us to make predictions about those things without actually having to do the physical experiment or wait for the real thing to happen. Um, uh, and there's quite a collection of those, but they all sort of share several basic principles that you have some kind of mathematical structure. So algebra is a structure. You might take a bunch of data and fit a straight line to it and allow you to predict what would happen next if you continued along the experiment. Now, algebra comes with a set of operations you can do on it, and then depending on the model, there are different kinds of operations. So with algebra, we can solve an equation, we can take the derivative, things like that. But if you talk about other kinds of modeling, like agent-based, where you write little programs to simulate people, and then you let 1,000 of these programs interact with each other, those don't have the same operations. Those you might just have to run and observe and collect data. Um, and very often they have parameters that if I do a straight line as a model in algebra, well, how steep is the line and how high up is the line? These are things that you can tune about the model to make it represent the real world better. And then we get into kind of tricky areas, is where does the model come from? And that's a bit more human creative, that sometimes you start with some understanding, physics. You might have the physics of, if I throw a ball through the air, it has certain kind of differential equations that describe its motion. I might not know how thick the air is, how heavy the ball is. Maybe I need to do some experiments to learn some of those things. But I have a model in mind because I understand something about, or I have a belief about how the system is likely to behave, and then I just have to kind of tune it to make it better. And sometimes we have no idea, and you have just data. You've done a bunch of experiments, you've got a bunch of numbers, and you want to predict what happens. You have no idea why or what the mechanism is, but there are patterns in the data, and you can just use data or certain structures that take data well to make these models. And that's where we get into all these much more sort of modern AI type ideas, where we've sort of let go of the idea of trying to write down the equations and we just use data. But in the end, they all come back to the same idea. Once we've got a representation, whether that's a representation of the physics of a ballistic projectile or a representation of human language in a large language model, we can then do kind of experiments on it. We can ask it to make predictions or simulate things or respond to inputs in a way that perhaps the real thing would have done.
So what are the thorny issues? What tends to go wrong with models
Ah,
out there in reality?
well, anytime you interact with a model, some things you ought to be thinking about beforehand, or somebody tells you they've got a model that will predict the future, or that all of these things have some level of assumptions up front. That, if I draw a straight line through some data because it looks like a straight line, I am making an assumption there that the data actually really is a straight line, give or take some random noise. That's, where that comes from is usually some kind of belief system. Sometimes we have to make assumptions because the model of the real thing is far, far too complicated. By projectile motion, we could say, well, we're going to assume that air has no real effect on it, and over maybe throwing a ball 10 feet, how humid the air is today and what today's air pressure is doesn't really make any practical difference. But then if you do something like space travel or projectiles of intercontinental ballistic missiles, that really does matter. So you have to make these choices of, do I want a more complex model, maybe is more accurate, or do I want a simpler model? But by making a simpler model, I have to assume things away by the belief that they are not going to influence the outcome. And sometimes that's just completely wrong.
So, I mean, one of the issues always seems to me to be people end up with a belief in models that's beyond the assumptions they set out and beyond the complexity of the model, sometimes. I mean, because sometimes models have been very successful.
Mm.
The model of, as you say, space travel is an example where you have a model, the thing, I mean, sometimes the thing goes catastrophically wrong, but when it doesn't, it basically abides by the model. And really quite successfully. It's quite extraordinary that you can predict, you're going to get to the moon at this point.
I think it's broadly true for many engineering models, that engineering models have proven so successful, they've made the technology possible. That
and I think the problem then is people have got this almost sort of godlike belief in the model sometimes, and they forget it's a model, it isn't the actual thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think the most massive version of this recently is the pandemic. And we won't know still, and we're still finding out over many years, all the consequences of the actions taken during the pandemic, such as locking people down, for example.
Yeah.
Now, the problem was there, it seems to me, that it's an incredibly complex system with huge numbers of unknowns, particularly at the start. We had no idea what the virus was doing, really. And there are lots of effects. I mean, there are immediate health effects of getting COVID. Actually, to credit, the lead person in Britain, I think, was very clear at laying this out at the beginning. He had the lead medical person, that there were three responsibilities he immediately had. One was, and this is the assumptions thing you bring up. One was, his job was to stop people getting sick or dying from COVID. But actually, there were two others that were very important. One was stop people dying, getting sick from other diseases. And the third one was deprivation, because, which in the end causes medical problems because people run out of money or whatever. And he was aware that he had to balance those, which I think was some credit to him. But the problem is when you set up a model, the model that says that the virus is going to spread in the following way and you're going to kill this number of people, it's very difficult to argue against that in a reasonable, moderate society, even if the long-term consequences from other effects might be much greater. So you've got this problem about the primacy of the primary effect, if I can put it that way. That's the thing I think is a worry.
So, well, I think this one, it brings together quite a few of these big issues in one place, because one problem you have there is that this very question, where does your model come from? In a lot of things, we have past experience. And so modeling things that have never happened before, or at least in a modern time where you have the data, where do you get that knowledge from? So there were questions like, well, if we have a lockdown, will people obey it? Who knows? We've never had a lockdown in our lifetime, in our kind of modern society, to know whether people would obey or not. And, there's totally unpredictable things like the way social media might react to that and drive conspiracy theories that there is just no prior data to predict. So what do? You have to guess. And that's a big uncertainty. Another thing about complex models is that every time you make one of these assumptions, you introduce some error. Now, for a simple model, that quite often is an acceptable thing. Your model might be 1 or 2% out, maybe 10% out. Maybe it's still useful though with that. But when you have complex models where the model of one part of a model feeds into the next part, these 1 or 2% errors or 10% errors very quickly add up. And once you're at 100% error, you basically don't have anything useful.
But I mean, there are basic assumptions that were often unknown. I mean, maybe these were known later. I do remember asking some senior people in the UK about this, which, I was always concerned about the assumption, maybe wrongly, I'm no biologist, about the idea that it was binary as to your infection risk, so to speak. And what I guess I haven't put that very well, but what I mean by that is there's a certain viral load you need to get infected. if you get that viral load and you can then measure an infection, the question is, if you had, let's say, 10 times that viral load, does it make it a worse infection for you? Right? Now, as far as I understand, all the models assumed no. So you get infected and you're measurably infected versus you're not measurably infected. There's no difference in the prediction of the outcome. Now, that seems like a detail, but it's one of these cases where, I mean, if you work that through, I have no idea whether I was right or wrong about that, but if you work that through, it makes a catastrophic difference to what you're trying to do. So, for example,
but in defense of modelers, you have to make some choices, and they didn't know, and also, so at some point you have to make some guesses.
So, what should one do? I mean, I think one societal question: we've got this huge computational modeling power. We had people standing up and saying, there will be this number of deaths. I can predict, this if we don't lock down, there'll be this number of deaths, and we can save this number of deaths by locking down, which is quite compelling, right? I mean, it's hard for a democratically elected government in most places to say, we're not going to do that, even though, in fact, that may be ignoring many multiple secondary, tertiary effects. Like we're seeing now in society. We're seeing a lot of mental health problems. We're seeing people with, economic deprivation for sure, and all sorts of other effects. People's children's learning in schools, some of the effects that one's seeing, which are going to be quite bad for many years, some of which were induced by the primary effect being handled to some extent.
Yeah. The trouble is, this depends on your kind of faith in the sophistication of your audience, because a true conversation, and maybe, amongst the scientists behind closed doors, the answer is, we have this model, but we don't know. And there's this famous line by, I think it's Box, the statistician, who said, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And that's the nuanced conversation is, really what you want as a society is to be saying, well, what are the assumptions? What are the error bars on that model? But the danger is you end up with a population and go, well, it's all wrong. The scientists have admitted they don't know. So what's the point in listening to them at all? Or you go too far the other way, where the scientists put up this bravado of, we have a model, we know, neither of which is correct. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but nuance is not something that plays very well in politics.
Yeah, well, I think that's the problem we've got. I think people, and also I think we're not, and we've talked about this before, we're not educated well in the nuance of computation at this moment. I mean, that's not what maths does. It's not where anywhere else in our mainstream educational system. It's actually even, I mean, there are some highly educated, technically educated people who are surprisingly bad at thinking about this, where you'd expect them to be good. So it's not really a thing necessarily that even comes with your, highfalutin degree in a technical subject. And I think, so one of the issues clearly here is an educational one, but let's not focus on that for this purpose. I think the thing I suppose I'm most concerned about at the moment is, which I think is most detrimental to society, is this thing where the primary effect has a number ascribed to it. Now, that may in fact be highly inaccurate anyway, even for the effect that you're looking at. But let's say for argument's sake, it isn't in a particular effect. There is a number that's ascribable to that. That's But then there are secondary and tertiary effects that just don't even see the light of day, because they are even harder to quantify, and the primary effect gets all the airtime. And that seems like a fairly new phenomenon in the world. I mean, of the order of decades, not hundreds of years. I mean, as in, I think that before there were various effects considered in a woollier way, but you didn't necessarily get one effect because it had a number associated with it that predominated thought of any of the others.
So I'm going to claim that this is actually an ancient problem in a completely different context. This is the Oracle of Delphi.
Yes,
and it's a new form. So I wish I could remember one of the specific ones, but the basic problem with the Oracle of Delphi is that it was the high priestesses who spoke for the gods that you would go to for advice, like a model built by scientists, and you would ask it a question, and in all the Greek myths there was some carelessly worded question that allowed the oracle to give an answer that could be interpreted in many different ways. And the hero would always go off with an interpretation and do completely the wrong thing. And it would turn out that the advice really meant the opposite. And I kind of feel like that's where we are with models to some extent, that the models become the oracle, but we're asking the wrong question and we're rushing through a belief that the gods have spoken to us in a certain direction without stopping to say, should I have asked a better question? And I think the pandemic's a good example of that. The question was focused on how can we have fewer people die from COVID? An important question, and surely the central question, but a more nuanced question would be, how do we balance that against the other society needs?
Which, to be fair, was asked in the UK context, for example. But there was a lot of pressure then from pressure groups who didn't totally understand that, I think, which may have caused the wrong thing to happen. But it's hard to know, because it's hard to know what the alternative effect would be, which is another of the problems here. No, I agree with you about the Oracle of Delphi. I mean, I think the error point is at a slightly different point, if I can put it that way. So the Oracle of Delphi problem is there's vagueness, apparently, in what's being said to you. I mean, on purpose. There are multiple things you could interpret it as. I think, as you're pointing out, that sometimes is a problem with a mathematical model, but often the problem is upstream of that, which is that you haven't asked the right question,
or the wrong question in the first place.
Right, and maybe that was a problem with the Oracle.
The wrong question.
The Oracle of Delphi, I have no idea, but and I think, but there is another issue which I think is related to that, which is the expert claiming afterwards that they were really right. I mean, so one of the big problems I think we have, and I think, as you say, people don't believe experts often. I mean, there's a set of people who simply refuse to listen to any of this, sort of like a pre-Enlightenment era, where it's kind of hocus pocus predominates. Now, you can see to some extent how this happened, because we have, as you say, experts who claim they know the answer based on the model they've carefully calculated and gives you a number, and they've either missed a bunch of other effects or it doesn't come out that way. Yeah. And so people stop trusting it. And it's very hard to pick between the expert who makes sense and the expert who doesn't make sense. The expert who actually nuances stuff probably doesn't get on television as easily or on social media. And so that's a problem. So we have basically, I suppose, incentives in order to generate extreme results which are unnuanced.
Yeah. There's another problem as well with the kind of the validation and proof that the model is safe and reliable, is that many of the most interesting questions we have are extrapolation questions, not interpolation. So what I mean by that is, rather than trying to say, we've sampled, stuff over the last 100 years, but we never measured what happened halfway through the year. Can we predict what happened halfway through? Whereas within the space of where you explored, models are pretty good at that. But when you start extrapolating and saying what will happen in the future, a space we've got no data on at all, then you end up, that's where these kind of hidden effects that you haven't thought about come in. So it's very easy to have a model where you can say, look, it predicts and fits the past perfectly, and then have this leap of faith that the future is going to be the same.
Yeah, I mean, another part of this is also your point earlier about how the model gets to be a model, right? So there's the sort that's, I mean, I don't know how to say this, but the sort that's very deliberate in the sense that, we have a theory of physics. There are laws of physics, which we think predict, how projectiles move. We can write an equation, we can write the equations of motion, et cetera, and we can predict where the projectile is. So there's kind of a cause and effect understood to some extent there. And you still may make mistakes because you may forget about an effect like air resistance or something, or you may decide it's too complicated a model and not do it and may get the wrong answer. And you may be wrong about the extent to which it mattered, but there is a kind of causality there. Then there's the other sort of model which is becoming much more common because you can get a lot more out apparently from less, where it's like you're looking at a whole bunch of data, you're somehow effectively trying to fit to that data or predict from that data what will next happen, where you have not the foggiest idea how it came about. And the trouble with that, I think, is that it's hard to track back. And so there are cases of catastrophic mistakes there, which it's sort of hard to track back to understand and therefore prevent for the future.
If we're on the topic of society as well, there's another factor, which is that the model, in a physics problem, the model is entirely independent from the experiment. Whatever you write down on that piece of paper for your model for the projectile motion is not going to affect the gun at all. But in society models, you get feedback that the very act of making a model, making predictions, deciding how we should behave, feeds back into the system and can cause feedback loops. The Dutch tulip bubble being an example, that the mental model for everyone, based on the evidence they were seeing, was that tulips prices would go up and therefore you should buy them. And you end up in a feedback loop where everyone's understanding feeds back into the system, self-fulfilling until, of course, it collapses. I often give the example, I talk to people in finance, so I always kind of point out to them the kind of mythical perfect algorithm that if I could come up with some model for the way the markets behave and predict exactly every share price movement for the next 24 hours, I'd make a ton of money and I'd be king of the world, but it wouldn't last long, because the very act of me taking all of the money out of the world will make everyone else trading go, well, whatever we're doing, it's wrong. Let's change what we're doing. And the act of me winning will cause resistance from the markets that I'm dealing with. So my model will be invalidated very quickly, depending on how quickly they cotton on to what's going on. The model would stop working and I would need a new model. And so you get these kind of things in anything where there's society feedback loops, where you're trying to model people's behavior, you are potentially affecting it and invalidating your own model by the act of publishing it. COVID examples being another one where the very dire predictions that were coming out helped to make people behave and lock down and take vaccines and so on. And so the model itself, it was affecting the outcome.
I mean, most things have feedback, honestly. It's actually pretty rare things don't have feedback in real life, in my experience. I mean, there are two things I always think is funny with these. It's like most, there's interconnection. Most probabilities and things are not independent of each other, right? The sort of belief in I mean, this is a typical problem that happens with models. Okay, so people say, I'm going to model a bunch of effects and I'm going to assume independence of this effect from this effect, that house prices in Britain are independent of house prices in the US. But in fact, in real life, most things are somewhat dependent on each other. And people forget that. And so they underestimate the dependence. I think they also get confused about correlation versus causality is a very common mistake. But the thing that sort of drives that is simplicity. So they think that the right way to go about it is to simplify the model so that they can run it. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean, if there are feedback loops particularly, that may be catastrophic for what it predicts in terms of being catastrophically wrong, because the feedback loops actually, on a fairly small apparent change, made a huge difference to the eventual outcome. So we should probably wrap up soon. And the question is, I mean, I suppose the question of the podcast in general is, does mathematical modeling improve society? And I suppose the follow-on question for that is there a way we can optimize the use of it?
Well, I'm going to be optimistic and claim that broadly speaking, it has, because broadly speaking, modeling has been useful and predictive, fabulously so in sciences, modestly so in social things like economics. And to make the most out of it, we need to ask those questions of how sure are you and what are you assuming, but not blame the modelers when they say, well, I made these assumptions and I'm not sure, because that's the reality. And let them be honest about the amount of uncertainty or the decisions they've made, because everyone has to make those compromises. It's not necessarily wrong, but it helps you to understand how seriously to take a model. And models are not the gods of Delphi. They don't know for sure about anything, but some are useful.
If the gods of Delphi in fact did, which is questionable too. Yeah, I almost feel like one needs a sort of little code of conduct for models and their use. I mean, I think that, I mean, you and I have a certain level of experience, probably beyond many people's experience with these things. And so we end up asking a series of questions to try and understand what's going on, and probably have some level of skepticism because of that. Those questions are not natural to people and they're not educated in them. So obviously step one is they've got to get educated in understanding those questions. And we've got to me, this is very much part of what I've been talking about with computational literacy across society. This is a part of that, which is you've got to understand when to believe something, when not to, why, how you cross-question it. I think there's a lot of responsibility on models. I think there's a fundamental thing that goes wrong, a tendency, which is to simplify things to try and make it easy for the model. And that's often the wrong thing to do. And it's born out of our traditional maths education pre-computer. That's where it comes from. It's sort of an attractive thing to do. To be fair, the latest sort of AI machine learning type thing does not do that. That's sort of the opposite approach. So that maybe counterbalances what's traditionally been the case. But I think we're generating a lot of problems with ourselves that way. And, I think also being clear, whenever you look at a model or prediction or whatever, what were the explicit assumptions made? What is the claimed assumption? Now, there may be assumptions made that were implicit and nobody understood, but let's at least start with the explicit ones and make sure we're clear about those before you go anywhere near what's going on. And also this, which is part of that, I think we can optimize the lot by not assuming, I mean, typically there are multiple effects. I mean, almost always. And the primary effect that you think you've got may not in fact be the primary effect. We got to ask those questions and how long we're trying to predict this over and what the sort of catastrophic risks are versus minor risks. So I think there's a lot of what I would call checklisting to do, both in society and amongst people who should know this. And that would improve the use. But I agree with you. Overall, being able to predict things using models has been, really powerful. And I think we want it to continue, but with those sort of, I don't know what you call them, those guardrails to make sure that it doesn't go as badly wrong as it has in the past.
And I think on my side of the fence, people like me need to have a little bit more courage to say, I've done the modeling, I don't know, but here's my best guess. And not over-egg the answer with the kind of pseudo reliability.
I mean, have confidence. Have confidence to say, I don't know. Always a good thing in life. On that note, thanks very much for watching and hope to see you on the next computational conversation.
Bye-bye.